it began at the turn of the century. An age when cars shared the road with horses. When airplanes took flight and radio waves first filled the air. An age that saw tremendous devastation and witnessed unparalleled growth. In Waukesha, a newly incorporated city just west of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the residents would celebrate New Year's Eve, 1899, unaware of the odyssey that lay ahead. The summer of 1860 was not unlike the many warm seasons which have come and gone through Wisconsin's history. It was, however, a very different world then. Visitors from the present might find it difficult to recognize the various contours of the land which have come to be known as the city of Waukesha. In 1860, Waukesha was still a small, budding village. The community was growing at a rapid pace, becoming the county seat as well as drawing more residents than other areas. By 1860, Waukesha had several newspapers, various mills, and was honored as the home of Governor Alexander Randall. A few years before, sometime in the mid-1850s, Herman Adolph Mayer entered the Waukesha scene. He opened a brewery nestled into a hill on North Street and began to market his product to the local saloons. Apparently, Mr. Mayer was not a particularly good brewer, as after only a few years his property was entrusted to the sheriff and he disappeared.
It seems like his enterprises kept failing, and he started by starting a small brewery on the north side of Waukesha, along the river, kind of tucked into the bluff on North Street. And he started that in the mid-1850s, and by about 1860 it was bankrupt. So he must not have been a very good brewer, and that's the brewery that eventually Stephan Weber bought.
Soon the war between the states erupted, and Waukesha was called upon to provide troops. Recruiting meetings were held in 1862, and the 28th Regiment, later entitled the Waukesha Regiment, was formed with Henry A. Mayer as company commander. 2 years of war passed, and in 1864, Mayer returned to begin yet another brewery.
Then he came back and opened a tavern downtown about 1860, and that only lasted a few years, and he sold that tavern to Matthias Schock.
Having disposed of my property and given possession of the saloon to M. Schock, I take this opportunity of returning my thanks to the public for the very liberal patronage bestowed upon me, hoping that the same will be extended to my successor. Henry Mayer.
Little did Mayer know that in the turbulent decade of the 1860s, his two failed attempts at brewing beer would eventually lead to two very successful and prosperous breweries, one of which would survive the emergence and decline of Waukesha's Springs era, Prohibition, Depression, and 2 world wars. By 1870, Waukesha's brewery industry had begun. Matthias Schock was born on February 19, 1823, and arrived in the U.S. in 1854. In the 1858 Waukesha Directory, he's listed as a stonemason with a residence along the river north of the railroad depot. In 1866, he purchased Mayer's failed business on the north side of Main Street and began to sell as well as bottle beer. Schock, unlike his predecessor, made his business successful, so much so that less than 10 years later he expanded. His new property was located directly across the Fox River from the White Rock property. Matthias deemed this new area the Fountain Brewery and commenced in creating a picnic area around it.
And it was a picnic grounds where people came to drink beer and party, to dance. They had a dance hall and picnic. So they would sponsor different groups there weekly and always advertise that this week so-and-so's orchestra is going to be playing out at the park.
Matthias died shortly after purchasing this new property, but his family carried on the tradition. Matthias's brother John was the next to run the business.
So the Schocks had the the picnic grounds. The Freeman advertised that, or made a joke at one time, they built a bridge across the river about where the Moreland Avenue Bridge is now, a little bit north of that. And the Freeman joked that invalids will make their way from White Rock Spring over to Schock's Brewery and have a few drinks after they were cured.
The Shook family and their various taverns, breweries, and saloons began to disappear near the turn of the century. Shook's Old Stand, the title for Matthias's first tavern back on Main Street, closed in the year 1907, and Shook's Saloon on Broadway met the same fate in 1917. The brewery and Shook's Grove on North Street were both sold in 1910 to the Almenara Spring Company for $9,000. The Shook family had owned and operated several saloons and popular breweries in Waukesha during the Springs era. They were the first in a series of highly successful brewery owners who owe their origins to Waukesha. Though prosperous on their own, the Shook's achievements pale in comparison to some of the breweries which came later. In 1822, another man who would become a legend in the brewing business was born. His name was Stephen Weber, and like Matthias Schock, he was an immigrant. After attempting to get started in Milwaukee, Weber noticed that a small brewery had gone up for sale in the village of Waukesha, just one day's travel west. Weber decided that this was his opportunity to make it on his own. There was no way he could have known that Richard Dunbar would arrive a few years later and ignite a public frenzy over health water in Waukesha. So, Stephen and his wife Rosina made the journey to Waukesha and inspected Henry Mayer's small outfit. Nestled into the side of a bluff which overlooked the city, it apparently was what they were looking for. Then, on April 19, 1862, he purchased the brewery and named it West Hill Brewery. Soon, Weber was producing beer and had established a favorable reputation among the residents of Waukesha.
I guess the story of the Weber Brewery is a story of the family and the brewery because they go so close together. The family ran the brewery, and there's just no way to separate the two.
11 years after moving into Henry Mayer's stone building, Stephen decided to remove the old brewery and build one of his own on the same spot. He continued to make additions and changes to his business, including a wagon for delivering his product in the city and a new type of cork which did not require a corkscrew. Then, even as Weber's business was changing, his family did so as well. Stephen's oldest son, John Paul, passed away in 1877. 2 years later, his second oldest son, William, married Julia Dick, and after another 2 years, Stephen's daughter, Barbara, was married to photographer John Land.
One might have mistrusted what it meant when Mr. John Land advertised that his gallery would be closed for a few days, for it was plain that he meant business of some kind. Yes, he has gone and done it, married one of Waukesha's fair ladies, Miss Barbara Weber, daughter of Stephen Weber, Esquire. Freeman Reporter.
In April of 1884, Stephen declared his intentions to retire in style, leaving a stipulation that his family must provide him with all the beverage he required for the duration of his retirement.
When the brewery was passed on from Stephen, it was passed on to both children. So John Land and William Weber went into business together. Now they took the brewery and changed the name to Bethesda Brewery to capitalize on the famous Bethesda Spring that was in town. And they named it Bethesda Brewery and went into business together, but they just didn't like each other. According to members of the family, that's all they can figure out, that these guys just didn't get along.
After a few years, the Land-Weber partnership dissolved, and William Weber became the sole proprietor of the Bethesda Brewery. Meanwhile, between 1884 and 1890, significant changes occurred in the building. There was an addition of an engine room, and power became coal-fueled. Light was still provided by candles, but the property expanded across the street with a larger ice house as well as a new bottling plant south of the old one. An 1899 article described Weber's product as the best beer in the world, known for absolute purity. 92% of the saloons in Waukesha were serving Bethesda beer, and production continued to increase with no apparent boundaries. As the Springs era began to disappear, the Bethesda Brewery, along with all of Waukesha, was headed for enormous changes. The century turned over, and 1900 struck the Weber family hard. William A. Weber died of a lung disease on May 21st, rather unexpectedly. He left a bit of a mess behind as his 8 children and widow Julia scrambled to put the pieces together. Later that year, John Land finally sold his remaining shares in the business, and on September 2nd, 1901, Stephen Weber, the founder of the entire organization, passed away. The 1900s brought uncertainty for the Webers and all of Waukesha, but the family was determined to continue, and so they did. It was New Year's Eve, 1899. The residents of Waukesha had seen a lot of change in recent years, the rise and fall of the Springs era, new and prosperous businesses, and, most recently, incorporation as a city. There was much to celebrate, much to look forward to. It was a new century, and everything promised to be challenging and different. A poem published in the December 28, 1899 issue of the Freeman read, "In the evanescent beauty of the winter morning's glow, come the footsteps of the new year, o'er the light and fleecy snow, and a happy welcome soundeth from the steeple-guarded chimes, and prophesy the tuneful bells, the dawn of better times." 1900 introduced changes everywhere as the last remnants of the Springs era began to fade away. Even the grand and glorious Fountain Spring House, once the pride of Waukesha residents, was struck by the new century. Business diminished, and in 1905 the $400,000 hotel was closed and put for sale at a mere $100,000. Meanwhile, an old-style Methodist mission called the Metropolitan Institute began to outgrow its Chicago headquarters, which consisted of several spots throughout the Windy City. The church's founders yearned for a consolidated location large enough to house the church's growing number of converts. In 1900, they officially broke away from the Methodists and were established as the Metropolitan Church Association. 5 years later, the new church's founders discovered exactly what they were looking for in Waukesha's Fountain Spring House, and, after a few negotiations, the Saratoga of the West was sold for $80,000.
And they had different buildings. They had a church, and they had all these different buildings for all these different things, and they decided that they really wanted to be under one roof. So when in 1905 the Fountain Spring House Hotel went up for sale, it actually went up for $100,000. They came up and looked at it and decided that that was just what they wanted. It had 400 rooms and a bathhouse outside and a lot of property. So they actually ended up purchasing it for $80,000. So it was a real buy.
The Metropolitan Church Association, or MCA, was dedicated to old-style mass revivalism, where average citizens took the pulpit and gave spellbinding sermons, often becoming hoarse in the process. Evangelists and missionaries from such places as Brazil, the Virgin Islands, India, South Africa, Norway, and Great Britain arrived on a regular basis to address the church's congregation. The title Camp Meeting was given to such occasions, as they were held in large tents on the MCA's property. Camp meetings were an important part of the church's operations and were major events on the calendar.
Every August, they'd set up huge tent across the street, and then it would last several days, and they would preach, and they would have singing, and a lot of their ladies would sing and have string instruments, and the men would have brass and string instruments. So it was enjoyed by all. Then they would have a small tent for the children, and they would attempt to sort of do the same thing for them.
Sermons and services given in the Metropolitan Church were energetic, certainly more boisterous than many of the traditional churches of the day.
Well, they were so enthusiastic about their religion. It's more or less like today if somebody's on a game show and they win something or become very excited and they start kind of jumping around and grabbing people and hugging. Well, these people were very enthusiastic about their religion. And not to say that it was every single person that was in it, but there were some that did. Well, when they first came to Waukesha, I mean, the people here were very laid back, and they didn't do that in church. And so when they observed these people doing that, they acquired the name of the Holy Jumpers.
All these characteristics of the MCA were unknown to the residents of Waukesha, who watched with anticipation as the new owners of the Fountain Spring House moved in. The first opportunity for Waukesha residents to meet the resort's new occupants occurred on March 11, 1906. While residents sat in hushed silence, the Reverend Duke M. Farson began to proclaim in rather exuberant tones some of the principles of the Metropolitan Church Association.
Real religion consists of conversion and sanctification. It's like a double-barreled shotgun. The former is of little use without the latter. Amen. Reverend Duke Farson.
As Farson reached pivotal points in his oration, the crowd of church members leapt from their chairs and shouted. Reverend W.T. Pettingill directed the chorus and sang solos. Others accommodated with the cornet and organ. Waukesha residents watched the proceedings with a sense of unease and shock. 4 days later, a Freeman reporter described the event.
Every moment there was something doing. The Holiness Band sang with tremendous gusto. The songs were rollicking and swinging, about 17 verses each. These people have remarkable length of wind and the utmost enthusiasm, every once in a while bounding up and down like a rubber ball, without stopping to take a breath. They say their prayers the same way. A Freeman reporter.
This religious zeal earned the members of the Metropolitan Church Association the unappreciated title of Holy Jumpers. Meanwhile, Waukesha community didn't exactly relish the church's rather vocal old-time revivalism. As a result, tension between the church and the community began to grow. 2 years after the church moved into the Fountain Spring House, the mutual feelings of resentment reached a summit. On May 23, 1907, divinity students and other church members were having a parade down the streets of Waukesha, proclaiming their faith in their usual exuberant way. Several citizens found the singing and shouting too much to bear and complained to Sheriff George L. Dwinell. The result was the arrest and incarceration of 17 students. Lawsuits were made and angry words were exchanged. Driven by community sentiment, the Common Council then adopted a petition allowing such crimes as jumping, shouting, and otherwise disturbing the peace to be punished by fines of $100 and 90 days in jail. In effect, the members of the MCA were restricted, almost imprisoned in the Fountain Spring House. For the once elegant and socially active building, this marked a drastic change. The new atmosphere was observed at the last public event ever to be held at the Fountain Spring House, the Floral Ball.
Exhortation will succeed the balance all of the caller, and memories of the gorgeous gowns will be erased by one glance at the severely plain dresses of the Holiness Band. A Chicago Herald reporter.
On the industrial scene, the new century brought another unexpected title to Waukesha, that of Cow County, USA. The early 1900s introduced a series of very profitable dairy farms in and around Waukesha. Keystone Farms were prominent in the development of mechanization. Brook Hill Farm was known for research and development in the new field of animal disease, and Wren Farms had the prestigious distinction of being one of the first in the United States to import registered cows from the Isle of Guernsey. The early 1900s were perhaps best known for unparalleled scientific advancements. For the first time ever, the residents of Waukesha illuminated their homes with electric lights, watched moving pictures, conversed over telephone lines, and listened to radio. The first known radio in Waukesha was built by L.E. Drew as a payment for a print job. The owner was Evan Thomas, proprietor of Thomas Press on Broadway. Thomas quickly became the most popular man in town, as he made various public appearances to showcase his contraption and explain its workings. Another technology which finally began to proliferate at the turn of the century was the telephone. Actually, the first few telephones in Waukesha were installed on December 2nd, 1882. Henry M. Yeomans, then publisher of the Freeman, was the first businessman to obtain the new gadget, and made sure to advertise its use in the edition of the paper. There was a subsequent boom, and the central switchboard made a couple of moves, finally ending up at 254 South Street in the year 1906. Within those few years, the number of subscribers had climbed from 15 to more than 260. The Waukesha Gas and Electric Company really began to provide widespread electrical service to the community during the first part of the century as well. Though it may be difficult to imagine a world bereft of electrical outlets, light bulbs, and other such items which are power dependent, such was the case for many years here and abroad. All of these magnificent achievements were an intricate part of life during the turn of the century. Waukesha watched as gas lamps became electric light bulbs, as live musical performances became radio shows, as conversations transcended physical space, and as buggies became cars.
To the city of Waukesha. Because of the limited time and extensive itinerary of the tour of the United States now in progress to encourage popular interest in aeronautics, it is impossible for the Spirit of St. Louis to land in your city. This message from the air, however, is sent to you to express our sincere appreciation of your interest in the tour and in the promotion and expansion of commercial aeronautics in the United States. Charles Lindbergh.
On August 22, 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew over Waukesha in an effort to drum up interest in airmail. Just a short time earlier, Lindbergh had returned from Paris as the first man to cross the Atlantic by air. In doing so, he had not only secured his place in history books, but also in the hearts of Americans everywhere, including Waukesha.
Hundreds waved and shouted when he flew over the city and only hoped that they could shake the hand of the man whose daring and courage won him so much admiration. Waukesha Freeman reporter.
Although Lindbergh did not land in Waukesha, he did take a short break in Fond du Lac before stopping in Madison. Lindbergh's campaign to introduce airmail was very successful, as evidenced in the many commercial mail businesses which exist today. Charles Lindbergh remained in the hearts of America until his death in 1974. They had to cut down a tree on what is now the Moore Downs Golf Course, but progress could not be stopped. After all, there had to be somewhere to land. In 1919, an unknown pilot made the first known airplane landing in the city of Waukesha. This event was one of the first in a long series of aviation triumphs, which centered around the city. It all began in the village of Honey Creek, where a man by the name of Robert Huggins was the first in the county to build his own airplane.
I lived near Honey Creek on a farm, and we were always interested in machinery and outdoor things anyhow, and there was a fellow in Honey Creek. He was building airplanes and home builds and things like that, and then he finally built a big monoplane wing and put it on a Jenny fuselage, which was used for just the fuselage used for the Army when they were teaching World War I pilots how to fly. And we kept watching him fly around, and he came flying around always sometimes near the farm, and I was sitting on the Davenport one Sunday afternoon, and I always rode motorcycles too, and I got the idea, I guess I'll go down there and see what it looks like where he's landing near the Honey Creek. So we get on the motorcycle, and I went down there and drove in and watched the airplane take off and land, and Bob Huggins' brother came over and asked me if I want to go for an airplane ride. Well, yes, no, but then it looked pretty interesting, so I says, okay. That's what my first ride was, and of course that sold me on airplanes.
Both Dean and Dale Kreitz became enamored with the concept of flying and began working on building their own plane. After assembling the entire body and engine from various parts, their first plane was ready for flight. Bob Huggins came over to make the first test run.
After we had it all together, Bob would take it out and he'd fly it down the field, and he'd take it off, and then he would land. He wouldn't go up in the air with it. He'd go down the field. I said, "Why didn't you let it go? Take off." Well, he'd go back, and I said, "God damn, it was going all right." And of course enough, next time he went down the field, and by gosh, all of a sudden, if he didn't take off and made a takeoff with it, here I'm sitting in a test stop in the front end. Well, he flew all around and went back down to where he was flying out of the field at Honey Creek and landed there, and everything looked all right. That's how I got interested in the airplane. That was our first airplane we had around there.
Of course, those early days of flying were not all fun and games. There were serious dangers involved.
Bob was down there carrying passengers at his Honey Creek, and I was coming home with him one night, and after we got through flying, just before it got dark, and I was riding in the front, and we was going to come in and land on a field where we had made the test flight off, and for some reason or other, the engine didn't go. He was trying to pull it over the tree so he could land in the field, and the engine didn't have enough power to pull us over the trees, so he tried to turn in the field, and we landed on the top of the trees. Well, after it all quieted down, of course, we ended up landed on the ground sideways, and we pulled it down out of the trees. Bob says, "How you feel? You okay?" "Yeah, I'm all right. How are you?" Well, anyhow, we got it back down on the wheels, and it looked like a shot duck, all the wings hanging down on the ground. That's how early aviation went.
That minor accident wasn't enough to stop them, though. The remnants of their first aircraft were sold to Russell Schutze of Waukesha, and the Kreitz brothers went on to build and fly yet another airplane. The second was built around a type of World War I biplane called a Jenny.
After we got this Jenny flying, I was at Mukwonago. So with this Jenny, I was just practicing taking off and landings without going around. It has a lot to help to get some experience, you know. And one day Bob came along, and he said, I was doing the same thing. He says, how about I guess I better go up around with you once or twice to be sure if you know how to get it back on the ground. And that's the way we got our instructions.
Meanwhile, aeronautic activity in Waukesha was mounting. In 1929, Russell Schutze, son of Charlie Schutze, finished his own Irwin plane with a few parts from Kreitz's first monoplane. And in 1930, Jack Miller of Waukesha made his first parachute jump. Meanwhile, photographer Warren O'Brien became interested in aviation and began to take aerial photos of Waukesha. Sometime in the late 1920s, Miller and O'Brien began to organize activity into a formal club.
Jack Miller kept going down there and asked Bob Huggins to come to Waukesha, so different ones of us started the aviation club, and I come up to the meetings up there. And different ones had airplanes, and there was breachers building airplanes, and gliders like that, and Russell Schutze built a home built, and he was out there testing hopping without any instruction too. So he had a lot of experience. And then the club, aviation club, was formed, and quite a few members in it, and we had a lot of them, the Waukesha, and they call it the Waukesha Flying Service because they got a Waco airplane, and to teach students how to fly. And of course they rented a field, Battinger's Field, right across from where it is now on the east side, and we were flying out of that field. And of course it wasn't a good field. You could, if you look at the size of it now compared to what we got now, it's real small. And we had a kind of an air show one day, and a fellow come in and caught the highline wires on the south side, and the airplane went upside down. Nobody got hurt, but it didn't do the airplane any good.
After a little persuasion, the city fathers gave the aviation club another chunk of land, that which now constitutes the Waukesha County Airport. With this new space, the members of the club were free to hold passenger sessions and eventually air shows. Interest in aviation only grew as more and more people began to give passengers the experience of flying. Pilots like Kreutz and Schutze would fly to various locations and give rides.
It's a long story. There's a lot of things you miss, and I could tell about different. But I'd go a lot of time, even though we were opping at the fields, someplace they'd have a picnic. Some friend of his, fellow I knew, out where he came from, they having a picnic out there, and we'd fly out there, and then we'd fly passengers all the time up there. Barnstorming, that's what they call barnstorming, things like that. We would have air shows coming, acrobatic pilots. Always somebody doing barnstormers that come around and do acrobatics, and parachute jumps, and things like that. So I was out there one night practicing with a hook on the wingtip, and I was going by picking up the handkerchief, and well, the inspector come along and says, "What you doing down there?" I says, "Oh, I'm just practicing for air shows." And then after that, I'd go around to different air shows, and with this biplane, I would fasten that hook on there. It's about 6 inches long with a fish hook on it. And of course, I'd just come down and fly by. You wouldn't do it always the first time. You want to make it look too easy. Of course, you could do it the first time, they think nothing to it, but you take it pretty careful, you know, because your wing is only that far from the ground, and to line it up, to pick that up, you know. Of course, when you fly as much as I did, you know just about where that wingtip was all the time. And I'd go to different air shows around the country and do the handkerchief pickup. Well, we went down to Chicago one time. They talked us all going down there, and we did the air show, and the guy, he got all the money, run off and left without paying us. Oh, there were runabout guys those days around all those air shows with a bunch of hunky guys, you know. But it was fun.
It wasn't long before the newly built Waukesha Airport began to attract large amounts of business and expand. Even today, as the airport continues to grow, passengers become enthusiastic about aviation after first witnessing the experience of flying.
Oh, that you just think you're like a bird. You're flying around up there and nothing underneath you. Holy smoke, yeah. Boy, it's a thrill, though. It's look down on your homestead and things flying around. Oh, you get a real thrill out of it, I tell you.
Another form of transportation which began to emerge around 1900 was the urban trolley. Though a good many community leaders were adamant opponents to Waukesha's downtown being urbanized by the addition of streetcar service, the newly formed Common Council eventually gave a franchise to the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, otherwise known as the TM, to provide local streetcar service. By 1898, the lines extended from Milwaukee to the eastern outskirts of Waukesha and then into the city, stopping at the corner of Barstow and Broadway. As the TM's popularity increased, the railway company proposed a plan to extend the rail line all the way through downtown and to Waukesha's western limits. The downtown businesses objected to this plan, but to no avail as, on July 6, 1899, workers began to tear up Broadway's pavement and lay tracks. The fire bell rang, and a large crowd arrived to protest. Leaders of the mob demanded that workmen lay down their tools, and a fire hose was hooked up to a nearby hydrant as a bit of persuasion. Many of the workers ended up wet, and Broadway was quickly cleared. The street remained empty, tools strewn about until a settlement was reached between the downtown businesses and the railway company, which didn't happen for nearly 2 days. The entire incident, fire bells, crowds, workers, and all, was unnervingly reminiscent of the 1892 water fight, in which James E. McElroy attempted to lay pipes carrying Waukesha water to the Chicago World's Fair. Unlike McElroy, the railway company was eventually successful, and by 1900 trolleys were crossing from one side of Waukesha to the other. Eventually, a rapid transit system would connect Waukesha to Milwaukee, Waukesha Beach, Delafield, Oconomowoc, Watertown, Racine, Kenosha, Port Washington, and many others. Today, the trolley serves as a symbol of the turn of the century, a reminder of days long gone. Photography had long been established by 1900. However, even in 1898, it remained either a lifelong profession or an expensive hobby. There were no instant developing cameras or autofocus digital lenses. If an indoors shot was called for, a flash pan needed to be pulled out and the powder ignited in order to catch the image on film. Yet none of these factors could keep Warren Sylvester O'Brien from capturing thousands upon thousands of images of Waukesha for future generations to look upon. Born on March 24, 1898, Warren O'Brien was the son of Daniel D. O'Brien and Emily Carlstedt, both of whom were 19th century portrait photographers. Daniel taught all of his children, including Warren, the various skills involved in photography. One of Warren's brothers, Obie, became a portrait photographer, and another brother, Clifford, became a newspaper photographer. Warren Sylvester began working for his father at the age of 14. He graduated from high school in 1917 and attended college, and by 1920 he became a full-time professional commercial photographer. In 1921, he opened a camera shop and print developer studio at 353 Broadway and hired Elizabeth Jones, who he met at a candy store, as his assistant. 6 years later, they were married. Together, Mr. and Mrs. O'Brien ran the camera shop for 32 years. So successful was their business that Warren was free to engage in other pursuits. He was interested in aerial photography and aviation in general. In 1931, he purchased an airplane and was very influential in the creation of the Aviation Club. Warren was president of the club 3 times and served in the U.S. Air Force for 30 years. In order to get aerial pictures of Waukesha, O'Brien would climb out under the wing of a biplane and, while clinging to the wires and poles for dear life, would hang over the edge and capture beautiful moments in time from far above Waukesha. O'Brien filmed from the clouds high above ground level, but he was also known for taking the camera into the depths of Lake Michigan via a diving bell. Warren also pushed the edge of technology by experimenting with motion pictures, eventually opening a complete motion picture division of his studio. Mr. and Mrs. O'Brien had one son, Dean, who followed his father and grandfather's footsteps by becoming a professional photographer and professor of mass communications and journalism at Wisconsin University. Both Mr. and Mrs. O'Brien were interested in a variety of subjects, ranging from astronomy to fossil collection. Warren S. O'Brien devoted his life to photography, and today much of our history is seen through his camera's lens. He pushed the edge of technology and seemed to be everywhere at once. Without his vigilance, artistic vision, and sense of history, Waukesha would be unable to see much of its past. The year 1916 witnessed an interesting new item being developed and marketed from Waukesha, Jiffy Gel. As the invention of 2 brothers, Otis and Fred Glidden, Jiffy Gel is similar to the modernly internationally distributed product called Jell-O. It all began around 1900 when Otis Glidden started a promising research career in the gelatin dessert business. He developed a procedure to concentrate the flavors of various fruits and preserve what he called the true fruit essence within small glass vials. Alcohol was used as the preservative. Otis and his brother Fred left New York and arrived in Waukesha with plans to market their new product. The two formed the Waukesha Pure Food Company and built a production plant on Elizabeth Street. It wasn't long before the new Jiffy Gel product was ready for sale.
It was put in boxes, made right here in Waukesha at the plant, which opened about 1916. And it opened up with a big national campaign where they advertised in women's magazines all over the country. And so they gave away a free Jell-O, free Jiffy Gel, if you sent in a coupon. And eventually they gave away aluminum Jell-O molds and other things.
The product was an instant success, generating a good deal of revenue. At the outbreak of World War I, the Pure Foods Company even sent a boxcar filled with Jiffy Gel to France. The Glidden brothers are also credited as being the inventors of what is now called the coffee break. At 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. each day, employees of the Pure Foods Company enjoyed a short break and snack time as refreshment carts bearing coffee, soft drinks, sweet rolls, and various other condiments were circulated among the lines. So revolutionary was the coffee break that reporters arrived in Waukesha to write articles about it. Unfortunately for the Pure Foods Company, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed on January 16, 1919. Prohibition, as it was called, made the use of alcohol for a preservative, or anything else for that matter, illegal. As a result, the Glidden brothers scrambled to find a new substitute for the alcohol preservative in their Jiffy Gel. Some chemists from Chicago discovered the desperately needed substitute, and it appeared that the Pure Foods Company was back in business. Fate, however, interjected, and the alcohol substitute began to turn bad and explode in the stores. In 1921, the Glidden brothers sold their company and the Jiffy Gel formulas to the Genesee Pure Food Company, which would later market a product called Jell-O. Otis Glidden went on to found the Edna Wallace Hopper Cosmetic Company on Barstow Street. He eventually moved to Chicago. The Pure Foods Company, during its existence, was known for being revolutionary in many aspects, not just for its coffee breaks or remarkably innovative products, but also for its production standards and employee benefits. At one point, the business was described as Waukesha's model food plant. The building stands still today, with a few additions, and though the Glidden brothers suffered many setbacks here in Waukesha, their achievements stand as a reminder of the inventive spirit.
I enlisted in the Army. I worked at the Waukesha Motor Company. And a friend of mine, George Krieger, he said, "Lee, let's join the Army." I said, "When I go home tonight, I'll ask my mother." I said, "Ma, can I join the Army?" Ma said, "That's up to you if you want to." So the next day, him and I, we went down, signed our name, had a checkup, had an inspection. The doctor was there. "Fine, you're okay. You can go anytime you want." The next day, we were down in Camp Douglas. No, we were drilling here on Main Street. I guess we drilled here, and we used the reform school. They had wooden guns, you know. We used their wooden guns marching up and down Main Street.
Leo Hurst was not the only one in Waukesha who signed up to join the American Expeditionary Force in the First World War. Troops from Wisconsin and Michigan formed and organized into the 128th Infantry Regiment. On January 24, 1918, after a short training period in Waco, Texas, the first troops arrived in France. One Waukesha resident, Captain Daniel J. Martin, achieved hero status for his leadership and courage during the First World War.
Headquarters, 20th Battalion, 128th Infantry, August 10th, 1918, to Edward R. Esberg, Mayor, Waukesha, Wisconsin. Dear Mr. Esberg, I will have to start by making an apology for pencil and paper, but it is the best material available. Yesterday morning, I had constructed a cross made from the part of the airplane in which Quentin Roosevelt was killed, and myself placed the cross at the head of his grave and inscribed thereon, First Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt, June 14, 1918, American aviator. His grave is just a mound of earth, like hundreds of others about us here on the hills. I have ordered a guard placed at this grave, and during the stay of this battalion in the vicinity, this guard will be maintained. I felt that the son of so prominent a citizen of our country was worthy of this slight respect I was able to bestow. The substance of this letter pertaining to Lieutenant Roosevelt I wish you would send to Colonel Roosevelt. He might care to know. I cannot send it to him from here. Very truly, Daniel J. Martin, Captain, 2nd Battalion, 128th Infantry.
September 18th, 1918. My dear Mayor Esberg, I am really touched by the letter you sent me. May I, through you, thank Captain Martin most kindly. Tell him how deeply I appreciate what he did in reference to the grave of my son, and that through him I would thank his battalion. I hope to see both the captain and yourself out at Stagmore Hill on some occasion in the near future, so that I may thank you in person. Faithfully yours, Theodore Roosevelt.
The First World War was one of mankind's greatest tragedies. 4 years were spent blasting at enemy lines, killing men in numbers never before imagined. France was completely devastated as trenches were dug from one end to the other.
Then when we got up the front line, we were in trenches, all mud, you know, and dirt, and whenever it rained, everything was flooded around there, and smelled like everything, rats running around. Oh, gee, it was just a regular muddy outfit. The person was lucky to live through it, but you got used to it. After a day or two, it was nothing. That's what war was. Yeah. Yeah, a day was forever. No, time never went fast. Never went fast. The whole city of Shadow 30, the homes were all wrecked, you know, and people's civilian clothes were on the bed, and it seems as though they got out of there in a hurry, because when the United States started bombing it, you know, everything was wrecked. The clothes, the people had clothes in the desks and the tables and all that. And you could lay in a bed, you know, at night and look all around the whole country, you might as well say. The roofs were always off. There was nothing on the roof anymore. Yeah, all the cities were all wrecks.
The First World War ushered in many newly devised ways of killing. A few were machine guns, tanks, airplanes, and chemical warfare.
You can smell it. You can smell it when the gas goes off. You can smell it in the air. It's a funny smell. And it's not only where you are, but it smells up the whole front line, because they drop shells all over the line, you know. It isn't only in front of one group of men. It's all over. It's all over.
After 4 years of war in Europe, the German lines collapsed and the Axis powers surrendered. Armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. It was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
You know, I remember I was in the hospital at that time, and the French soldiers, they were all hollering, "La guerre finie, la guerre finie." They were all yelling out, "The war is over, you know, the war is over." Boy. Sure, la guerre finie, la guerre finie. Of course, I was lucky. I still went through it all. I could have got killed, too. Yeah. Yeah, I was one of the lucky ones, I think. Yeah.
The sun rises on Pewaukee Lake, and as its warming rays reach across the waters, life on the lakefront begins to stir. It's a summer day in the year 1910. Foster C. Phelps and Ted Toll make their last few preparations. Finally, much to the enjoyment of crowds of people from all over southeastern Wisconsin, Waukesha Beach opens. 17 years earlier, two Waukesha residents, P.J. Buckley and T.E. Ryan, purchased a portion of land along the southern side of Pewaukee Lake, where they built a pavilion and dining area. The two named their new plot Waukesha Beach. At the turn of the century, Waukesha Beach was purchased by Foster C. Phelps, owner of a Waukesha resort hotel. He hired Ted Toll as manager, and the two began to landscape their property.
Well, they had a lot of flower beds, and there were a lot of stately trees. In the pavilion, you could either roller skate or you could dance, and it was open on both sides to let the fresh air in, so you could dance for hours. And in the corner, when the band wasn't there, in the corner there was a Wurlitzer band organ, and it played waltzes and foxtrots.
At first, Waukesha Beach was a nice, calm place to go and relax a bit. Visitors could take a leisurely stroll along the beachfront or go diving from an enormous platform. Then, on 1910, the fate of the beach changed as a small roller coaster called the Figure 8 was constructed. The ride was immensely popular, drawing crowds in ever-growing numbers and subsequently causing an explosion of activity. Rides, concession stands, and games began to appear. More boats began to make stops at Waukesha Beach, and trolley lines began to arrive with visitors on a daily basis. The ownership of the beach passed to former manager Ted Toll, who helped to bring a new level of excitement to the park. 2 new roller coasters were added, the Hummingbird and, finally, the Bobs. In addition to the roller coasters and rides, there was a funhouse filled with mirrors and moving floors, as well as the Mystic Gorge.
And then there were some hair-raising figurations with flashing eyes that would, of course, cause the ladies to scream. And then later that was called the Tunnel of Love.
Many other amusements awaited visitors, as Waukesha Beach was quickly becoming what it would eventually be advertised as the place to go. While crowds rushed to Waukesha Beach for entertainment, downtown Waukesha began to develop a new life. The Springs era was dead, and the void left by Waukesha's bout with national fame was slowly being filled by the kinds of places known to most prosperous cities of the 1900s. There were dime stores, department stores, restaurants, and the occasional novelty shop. One restaurant which earned a reputation for excellence downtown was Goff's Restaurant, named after its founders, Chet and Helen Goff. It opened on New Year's Eve 1892 on Clinton Avenue. Goff's became a Waukesha classic and remained in business until 1959. For many, it was a perfect place to spend a few relaxing hours discussing sports, politics, and the doings of the community. So popular was the small restaurant that customers would line up all the way to Wisconsin Avenue for Goff's food. Another favorite stop for Waukesha residents was Bostwick's. Opened in 1915 by Frank Bostwick, the ice cream and candy store was extremely popular among high school students, as well as adults. The shop had doors on both Grand Avenue and Main Street, with counters displaying candy lining the walls. One end was the dining area with the jukebox, soda fountain, and counter from which the various flavored sundaes could be ordered. The store's ownership changed several times through the years, but the aroma of sweets and the hours spent laughing with friends never left. When Milwaukee resident John Weber, of no relation to the Weber brewing family, purchased an 87-acre plot on the northern side of Waukesha, he did not expect that it would eventually lead to a mud bath and health resort. Yet a conversation with German doctor William Beckers, who was familiar with the mud baths in Germany, led him to investigate whether the black moor which covered the property could serve the same purpose as the famous European baths. After an analysis from Marquette University professor William Summers and a trip to Germany, the decision was made, the plans were drawn, and the Grandview Health Resort was built. The 30-room hotel and resort opened on February 22, 1911. Weber's son John Jr. was called up from Chicago to help manage the resort as it quickly grew in popularity. Andrew J. Frame and 2 other Waukesha residents planned and financed the addition of a 9-hole golf course in 1919. By then, a 30-room addition to the main building had already been made to accommodate the growing number of customers. In 1916, John Jr. patented a new type of couch for the mud baths. Made from terracotta, this new utility was heated and made cleanup much easier. The more mud baths continued to grow, adding yet another wing in 1921 and a ladies' bath department in 1926. One final addition to the building was made in 1928, consisting of an east wing. By then, the baths had grown to 108 rooms and a capacity to accept 200 visitors a day. Improvements throughout the entire building were made to include electric lighting and a new steam heating equipment. Then, by 1929, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression struck the entire country, Waukesha included. The Grandview Health Resort was forced to refocus its attention on attracting wealthy Chicago visitors. At that point, the baths took a decidedly flamboyant turn, becoming known for slot machines and poker, as well as the traditional golf, baths, and massages. In 1946, John Weber Jr. retired from managing the Moore Mud Baths, and in 1950 the property was sold to the Salvation Brothers of New York, who turned it into a college. Finally, in November of 1972, the building that once housed the famous Moore Mud Baths was purchased by the government and refurbished into the county office building. Life in Waukesha in the 1900s wasn't really all that different from today. Residents lived, worked, endured hardships, and enjoyed all that life had to offer. One young lady, Mabel Rice, left behind a glimpse of that world through her diary. In 1913, she was 18 years old and living with her aunt and uncle here in Waukesha.
January 1st, 1913. Well, little diary, I will try and write just a little in you every day. And to start with, I am going to tell you how I started the new year 1913, which I hope will be a lucky one for me and will not bring me any sorrows. March 4th. This Memorial Day, one that will be remembered in the pages of history, for it is Inauguration Day, and, after 11 o'clock, Wilbur Lumber's whistle gave an awful toot, for it was 12 o'clock in Washington, and it was at that moment that Wilson took his oath of office. Goodbye, old Billy Taft. March 23rd, Easter Sunday, but it was such a dark, gloomy day. It rained so hard while we were in church that when we got out the streets were miniature ponds. We had to walk through town in order to get home, and I stopped off at Bostwick's for ice cream. Of course, when we got home, they all wanted to know where we had been for so long. June 22nd. This afternoon, 6 of us, Edith, Ethel, Harry, Walter, Everett, and I, walked out to Northview, stopping on the way to take pictures. We went up to Dr. Roberts' farm, which is at Northview, and we took pictures. The boys then suggested going to Waukesha Beach. We took the next car out and arrived at 6 o'clock. We took more pictures, and then took a steamer across the lake to Lakeside, where we had supper. We had a jolly time there, and we girls helped ourselves to the carnations that stood in the center of the table. We took a steamer back to the beach and took the next car home. Then we went to Goff's and had a little refreshment, consisting of pie a la mode. We certainly had a dandy time all day long. December 31st, 1913. As Uncle and Aunt have gone to a surprise party at Brown's, and will be up there until 12, we had the house to ourselves. We made popcorn balls and munched candy. Then about 11:30 we made tea, and had tea and sandwiches at 12, when the bells started to ring and the whistles blew, and I grabbed several tin pans and knives and began making an awful racket, until all the whistles stopped, and it was the end of the year 1913. Ring out the old, ring in the new, and we started on another year. What is in store for us, we do not know, but here's hoping 1914 will be as prosperous and happy a year as 1913 for me. Mabel Rice.
By 1900, the Bethesda Brewing Company, run by the Weber family, had been around for nearly 50 years. However, the deaths of William Weber and the company's founder, Stephen Weber, had left the business and family stunned.
So luckily, some of the children had started to work in the brewery, so they were able to carry on. But basically, everybody says it was his widow, Julia, that ran the show, and she ran it for almost the rest of her life, even when Prohibition came along and brewing stopped. She kept the brewery going. She called the shots.
In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified and made into law. Prohibition, called a grand experiment by some and an utter failure by others, rendered the purchase, ownership, and brewing of alcohol illegal. This obviously had quite an effect upon the brewing industry.
Killian was one of William's sons. So Killian was sort of the businessman, and he had some contacts around town, and they took the brewery and made it into the Waukesha Dairy Company, and changed the entire operation into a milk operation, which is pretty tough to do. When Prohibition came, then they turned it into a dairy. But during that whole time, they kept the Weber Brewing Company corporation active. They didn't dissolve it, which we can't figure out why, unless they saw that Prohibition wouldn't last. But they always had that corporation in addition to the Waukesha Dairy Corporation.
Prohibition did end, and after 12 years of illegal bars, gangsters, and escalating speculation on the stock market, prosperity disappeared with the crash of 1929, and Prohibition ended shortly after, in April 1933. The Weber milk plant was reconverted back to a brewery, and production of the famous old-fashioned brew resumed. Killian Weber became president and manager of the Weber Brewing Company. Killian was an active member in the Waukesha community. He served many years as a volunteer fireman, was a member of both the Elks Club and the Merrill Hills Country Club, as well as holding a position as secretary on the Waukesha Water Commission. Killian died in November of 1942, leaving the business to his older brother Stephen, who was named after his grandfather and the original founder of the West Hill Brewery. Under Stephen's management, production nearly tripled from 1942 to 1948. However, the Weber Brewery simply could not compete with many of the larger businesses, and in the first half of the 1950s, the members of the family decided to sell their stocks and relinquish control of the business.
They had a controlling interest in the brewery for 91 years. And so it was almost 100 years that from when Stephan founded the brewery to when they sold.
In the 1890s, Waukesha was astir with rumors that a new brewery was to be built in the city.
Plans were announced in the early 1890s that there was going to be this new brewery in town, but nothing ever happened until about 1893. And that's when a group of Chicago investors started this brewery called the Waukesha Spring Brewing Company. And they were tavern owners and liquor dealers that wanted to capitalize on Waukesha's fame. But right after, as soon as they had the brewery built, it went into bankruptcy, and it just kept happening. They would reorganize, get some more money, and would go into bankruptcy again. And it happened on and off for the first few years of the life of the brewery. But when they did finally get the building built and off the ground, there was a big ceremony in town, and all dignitaries came from Chicago. And they had a big, a special train that came up, and the mayors of Milwaukee and Chicago and various cities were here, and they paraded down to the Klismic Spring, or the Hygeia Spring House, where they had a picnic and they drank beverages, and then they all paraded up to the brewery building, and they had a big ceremony at the cornerstone when they laid the cornerstone.
It was the same year that the city of Waukesha had been incorporated that Imperial Spring Brewing was founded. That name didn't last long, as in 1900 the business was once again renamed, this time becoming the Milwaukee Waukesha Brewing Company.
probably one of the neatest features of the brewery was the big spring house that was out in front. And in a city which had really unique spring houses, this one was fairly unique. It was in the shape of a big bottle. And on top of the bottle, originally there was an eagle, and then later a fox head. As the one of the early brands of the Waukesha Spring Brewing Company and the Waukesha Imperial Spring Brewing Company was their fox head beers. And so they eventually, that became a popular brand. And on top of the big spring house was a big fox head.
The Milwaukee Waukesha Brewing Company followed a similar path as that of Weber Brewing. The company was doing well, and then during Prohibition it had to change over to a soda and bottled water business. When Prohibition ended, the employees of what became the Foxhead Waukesha Corporation had quite a party.
The brewing cellars had been sealed up for 14 years during Prohibition, and were, at the time that the law allowed, opened up, and they started to re-brew the beer for the first time. And so they had a big celebration when that happened, when Prohibition was lifted. In 1934, they built an office addition to the brewery. And I guess this is one of the funny stories that I've ever read, because they had this big formal ceremony, and Mrs. Lindeman she put a bottle of beer in the cornerstone, and then they were going to seal it up. And she did that, and then they were supposed to have some speeches by the mayor and various other people, but the manager of the company announced that after the ceremony they would have serve sandwiches and beer inside the brewery. And as soon as the crowd heard that, they all ran into the brewery, and so poor Mrs. Lindeman was left was left to finish up the ceremony pretty much by herself, because everybody was inside enjoying the free beer and sandwiches. The crowd, the band played Cheer Cheer, the gang's all here, and everything worked out just fine.
The Foxhead Corporation continued into the 40s and 50s with a variety of popular products, such as the Foxhead 400. In October of 1958, Foxhead purchased Weber Brewing Company and transferred all operations from Weber's North Street location to the Foxhead plant on Maple Avenue. Today, only a small portion of what was once the Foxhead plant remains, and within those walls a new microbrewery opened in 1996, a full century after the opening of Foxhead. In the end, history isn't about this place or that, this building here or this date. It's about people. The people who make the world we live in today. People like Morris Cutler, Colonel Richard Dunbar, Leo Hurst, so many others, far too many to name them all. The turn of the century is such an interesting time period. So much changed in such a short time. Those who knew the 19th century were in for quite a shock as the 20th rolled around, and such amenities as airplanes, telephones, and radios became commonplace. The city of Waukesha grew and changed, adapted to the brave new world of the 1900s. Today, the 20th century is nearly over. We now look forward to a brand new horizon, new goals, new ideas, new challenges. May the next century be as prosperous and happy for Waukesha as the last has been.